Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 607, Racks. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am so good. Thing one, Aaron is home for the night because he had a doctor's appointment today. So he's at the doctor and I'm talking to you. But this morning he got up crazy early with me and went for a walk. And it was beautiful and we got to talk and it was fun. And yeah, it was great. It's nice when your kids grow up and you actually like them. And at some point in the next, I don't know how long, I will be able to show you the work Aaron is doing on his senior thesis film. This one's going to be twice as long as the last one, and it's really coming together. I think I mentioned that last week. Anyway, it is still continuing to come together, and he's casting right now, so that's kind of fun. What else have I been up to? I have been still working on fixing books. I got to go to the Sheep and Wool Festival, New Jersey Sheep and Wool, just outside of Flemington last weekend, so I got to see Candy in person. Woo! And since then, I've been trying to create sock yarn out of two different kinds of yarn by plying them together, and made a bit of a mistake, not in direction or anything, but when I plied them together, the second yarn that I was adding to the main yarn being merino sock yarn, just a little too thin for me. I wanted to add something strong since I tend to go through the bottom of my socks. So we thought, ooh, what if you ply it with some silk? And on my way out, I found the silk. So I was so excited. It was a 4-ply though, still sock weight, not quite lace weight. It's thin, but it's not that thin. And it's 4-ply, which probably was a mistake. And I'll tell you why. I plied them together. They look lovely together. That kind of wasn't the point, because the silk being shiny kind of dominates the color of the other one. And that's not so good. It's just not looking right. So I needed to unply it and do at least only 2 plies of the silk in with the sock yarn. And unplying the overplied yarn has been funny. Funnier still is unplying the silk itself, because as we know, silk is kind of sticky. It's one of the good things about silk. So unplying it has been quite a to-do. Had it been a 2-ply, would not be this hard, because the genius way I saw somebody unply 2-ply yarn goes like this. Take a dowel or a tube, like a paper towel tube, something that you can tape the plies to. So you have one end of one strand, 1 ply, and the other end, each taped onto the ends of the paper towel tube. Okay, that's fine. And then it's going down to the ball. This works best when it's a ball that you can pull the center strand out of. Then everybody on the internet is taking plastic bags and twisty ties, because you can kind of adjust the way you wrap the neck of the bag and how you apply the twisty tie to make it either less slippery or more slippery, because what you're going to do is you're going to start rolling the paper towel tube, which means you'd be wrapping those plies around the ends of the paper towel tube. And you're going to do this while you're standing up. And you want that bag with the ball of yarn in it to hang down so that it untwists itself, right? You roll it as far up as you can and then pause, let a little bit more yarn out of the bag. That's why you need it to be tensioned there so that it doesn't just drop to the floor. You need that, well, the weight on the yarn itself to spin out the ply, to unply itself, basically. So you reposition the yarn, get that bag tightened up again, and then keep rolling. And it's genius, and it does work. And it almost worked with the 4-ply. I got a lot unplied. And then I hit a place where, you know how in Ghostbusters they say don't cross the streams? That was what happened with my plies of yarn. They crossed, and there was no way that the 2 plies that I was wrapping, 2 on each end of my tube, were going to ever unply at that point. They just crossed each other in a sticky way that was not going to play nice. So I was heartbroken and have had to since make little bobbins, and I am unplying the 4 plies, mostly in the same way. And I've been using actually a Ziploc bag instead of using a twisty tie. The Ziploc, the kind of Ziploc that has the little plastic zipper piece that you roll back and forth across the bag top, instead of just the pinchy Ziploc. So it's been interesting. It gives me something to do while I'm on phone calls, listening to COVID calls to assure quality on the calls in Pennsylvania. It's what I've been doing. So that was fun. The other thing I've been doing is learning a lot about packing for travel. I stumbled on, happily, a woman named Sara, who is originally was an architect and has, I don't know, for the last 20 years or so, been doing tours and does a bunch of videos about packing light for travel. I'm going to both be going to Ireland shortly. Woo-hoo! But then I'm also going to Germany to visit my sister. My mom and I are going. So I don't want to carry around huge draggy bags full of things if I don't have to. I would much prefer no draggy bags. That said, sometimes you need draggy bags. No, the thing that I've always had trouble with in the past when it comes to packing is not really having any metric to use to judge what I'm going to need/want. As we know, kind of having too many options often leads to there's no way I can make a decision here. My brain won't do that for me. So finding limits that you can place on the decisions you're making or metrics that you can measure by, always helpful. Her metric is what is the weight of a carry-on bag, the weight and size of a carry-on bag. You take that, and for the airline we're traveling on, I think it's 22 pounds. You take that, and then you start weighing your clothes. You have 2 pairs of jeans. One weighs 2 ounces and one weighs 12. Your decision is made for you. You take the lighter weight pair of jeans. I am finding this to be a remarkably liberating concept for packing for travel. It's kind of like in, what was it? All I want to say is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Totally not. Wrinkle in Time. Margaret Langle has, I can't remember if it's Miss Whatsit, or Miss Which, or Miss Who, which is the one who never talks. Anyway, it's the one that talks. I think it's Miss Whatsit, talking to Meg and Calvin about sonnets. And Meg doesn't like sonnets because there's so many rules. And she points out, well, actually, the beautiful thing about a sonnet is that it has these rules that constrain you so that there is structure, but within that structure, you can say anything. And I find that that example, that became a reference point for me early on in lots of different things, that constraints that were being placed on you weren't always bad. I mean, some of them certainly are, but if the constraint is one that gives you structure, like a limited budget on a play, it was very, very clear at UCLA that the faculty shows, where it was faculty directed and they had a budget that was enormous compared to what student shows had, the faculty shows were always beautiful to look at. Gorgeous costumes, amazing sets, fabulous. But they weren't always very good. And the student shows, being a little bit more scrappy, even the ones that were directed by MFAs, they had a limited budget and they had to be really creative in solving the problems, whether it's, how do we do a special effect on stage with no budget, to how are we going to make 17th century clothing out of whatever we can get at the thrift store? And that made for actually much better shows. They were able to focus on more important things than just spending money. So I am finding these constraints from Sara to be really cool. As a consequence, I'm going to share links out to her YouTube playlist for packing light for travel, and then a couple other videos of hers that I think you might like. I'm also passing along a very irreverent and occasionally explicit video podcast that's 3 engineers, 1 in the UK, 2 in Philadelphia. They have a podcast with slides, so video podcast, called Well, There's Your Problem. And it's engineers talking about, well, that's why that failed. And the one Aaron wanted me to watch was on the Titanic. And it was fascinating because they had a guy on named Kyle who is like an encyclopedia of everything Titanic. He's been working on a role-playing game online. It's being crowdfunded. It's You're on the Titanic. What do you do? That's the game. As a consequence, he wants it to be as accurate as possible. So he's done all sorts of research. And it's very irreverent. And the guys are cracking, the other 3, the engineers are cracking jokes all the time. And sometimes it does get a little obnoxious. Sometimes it's genius. And this is why they have these experts on. Kyle was there to not only give you some insight into things that we didn't know about that happened with the whole Titanic lead up from building all the way through to sinking, but also to debunk a bunch of conspiracy theories about the Titanic. Like the one that comes to mind most specifically is evidently there's a whole subset of people who think that the Titanic sank because the steel was substandard. Pieces of the Titanic hull have been brought up and the steel was tested and, it had too much, I don't know, zinc in it or not enough something or whatever. It wasn't good, I'm using air quotes, steel. And the guy said, no, it's true. We did bring up steel from the hull of the Titanic and it was tested and it wasn't the best steel in the world. But the problem is nobody went and looked at the results of other hulls built at the same time that got tested. The media doesn't want to go do that legwork and give you an actual time-corrected comparison. All the steel that was being made then was not up to today's standards. It was all substandard steel. So was the Titanic uniquely weak? No, not at all. It was uniquely hit by an iceberg in exactly the wrong way. But it was information like that. It was an interesting podcast. It's also really long because the guy gets interrupted a lot and there's a lot of known knowns about the Titanic. So I'm putting a link to that for you as well. They have the second one that popped up in my feed after the first 2 Titanic episodes, because they split it into 2 episodes, was the Hindenburg. And actually one of the 3 engineers is the expert on the Hindenburg. And that's fascinating too. I'm only like a third of the way into it, but I do have to say, I really love the name of the podcast because, well, there's your problem. Just kind of seems awesome to me. I don't know what that says about me though, but lots of fun. But again, if you're going to be offended by snarky jokes or some occasional expletives, not the podcast for you. And the last thing I wanted to say, as an American, we've been obviously watching a lot about the Queen and her passing, and I've been seeing lots of opinionizing happening all over the place about whether countries that are part of the British Commonwealth should leave the Commonwealth. It's totally voluntary to be part of the Commonwealth. Previous colonies can stay or go. There's no financial or legal constraint. Mostly, I think it sounds like being part of the Commonwealth is kind of like being a mini UN. You have an easy way to communicate amongst yourselves. And you technically have a queen. Does she have any power? No. Or now a king. Does he have any power to control anything in the Commonwealth? No, not beyond just being able to get together and talk. I've seen a lot of opinionizing going on over the benefit, the cost-benefit analysis and all of those things. And I do have a video for you on that as well by TLDR News, where they went through and actually did the budget breakdown on how much does the royal family cost or how much does it make for the UK. And I was fascinated by it because they don't start by looking at how much worth could be assigned to the British monarchy. Instead, they start with Coca-Cola. And so they give you your context and your frame of reference for how these numbers get determined. And then they go into the monarchy. And actually the determination of the monarchy's value and cost is able to be much more accurate than Coke. So that was also interesting. Anyway, the only thing I really wanted to say is this. Living in a country that does not have a head of state who is in charge of basically protocol, the niceties of things. There have been times during my lifetime where I thought, wow, that was not something the president really should have been distracted by. Dude needed to be focused on other things than hosting a dinner party. We in the United States expect our president to fulfill both functions, both prime minister and a 4-year or 8-year long monarch, basically somebody who's the head of state, who's doing all of the cultural things and representing the United States in kind of a philosophical way as well as in a legal sense. It's a lot. It's not always good. It's not always a good combo. And this was especially brought home to me watching the Queen. There was a documentary on Queen Elizabeth II at some point that popped up in my feed, and it was playing while I was making masks. So I looked up, and they were showing a short video of the Queen going to Ireland, which happened not very long ago. And she clearly took a lesson from young Charles, who, if you watch The Crown, you saw rather famously when he became Prince of Wales, made his speech, part of his speech, in Welsh, got himself tutored specifically so he could speak in Welsh, which is not a small thing. And it mattered. There was a clip of Elizabeth, the first monarch to go to Ireland in a really long time. And the parliamentary treatment of the Irish for centuries was dubious at best and just downright genocidal at other points. Big deal for Elizabeth to go. Did it take her too long to? Probably, but go she did. And when she stood up to speak at the banquet, I think it was the opening banquet, she spoke in Gaelic. And as you're watching the clip, you can see the head of state next to her, the Irish head of state, mouthing, "Oh my God, wow." And she's just gobsmacked. And I thought, okay, that's important. And could a president have done it? Probably. But then the next thing that happened was they showed a clip of Elizabeth out at one of the memorials apologizing for history. And she did it really gracefully and beautifully. And the commentator said something that I went, that's it. That by the Queen doing the apologizing, doing the head of state dignitary things, she paved the way for the people who were going to deal with the legal and the political side of things to not have to worry about those. The past was acknowledged, recognized as appallingly, apologized for, stated out loud in front of God and everybody, hoping for a better future together. And then the Queen gets out of the way so that everybody else can go around and get things done. And I thought, okay, that actually makes sense, because we have so much bad faith arguing and discussing of things going on, certainly in the United States. There's a lot of bad faith. Assumptions are made as though they are fact about the people who are of a different opinion than you. And it's not doing anybody any good. But then we don't have anyone who carries the kind of moral, or maybe not moral, societal gravitas that a queen would. Somebody to come in and say, now, children, it's time for everybody to play nice. And I don't know if we need a queen, but it wouldn't be so bad to have somebody who could come in and calm the waters. And Joan. Joan needs somebody. She needs an advocate. Today's chapters are a little odd in that I think in these 3 chapters, they're not particularly long. I think Twain is stalling. I think he doesn't want to get to the next bit quite yet. So the first chapter, there are some jokes, and they are all jokes about language. And so I'm going to give you some spellings right now. Cauchon, Pierre Cauchon, the guy who is spearheading the fight against Joan, his last name is spelled Cauchon. That's his name. And then there's Cochon, Cochon. And that means something different, which you will hear. And then there's Cochonner, which is Cochonner. And actually, another variation on that, Cochonnerie, cochonnerie. All of these have different meanings. They get spelled out for you as far as meaning goes, but they're being pronounced and John Greenman does not spell them for you, so you can't see how the words work in writing, but you hear in your ears the important part, that these words all sound interchangeable, and so it's easy to make jokes. In the second chapter, there is a throwaway line about Cochon in heaven. Just listen for it. It's dry and very much in keeping with Mark Twain's Adam and Eve books, and it's smart and funny. And I think that's everything I wanted to mention before we listen. All right, here we go with Book 3, Chapters 16 through 18 of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Volume 2, Book 3, Chapter 16, Joan Stands Defiant Before the Rack. The brilliant weather, the heavenly weather, the bewitching weather, made everybody's heart to sing, as I have told you. Yes, Rouen was feeling light-hearted and gay, and most willing and ready to break out and laugh upon the least occasion. And so when the news went around that the young girl in the Tower had scored another defeat against Bishop Cochon, there was abundant laughter among the citizens of both parties, for they all hated the bishop. It is true, the English-hearted majority of the people wanted Joan burned, but that did not keep them from laughing at the man they hated. It would have been perilous for anybody to laugh at the English chiefs or at the majority of Cochon's assistant judges, but to laugh at Cochon or d'Estivée and Loiseleur was safe. Nobody would report it. The difference between Cochon and cochon, Note 1, hog or pig, end of Note 1, was not noticeable in speech, and so there was plenty of opportunity for puns. The opportunities were not thrown away. Some of the jokes got well worn in the course of 2 or 3 months from repeated use. For every time Cochon started a new trial, the folk said, "The sow has littered." Note 2. Cochonner, to litter, to farrow, also to make a mess of. End of Note 2. The sow has littered again, and every time the trial failed they said it over again, with its other meaning, the hog has made a mess of it. And so, on the 3rd of May, Noel and I, drifting about the town, heard many a wide-mouthed lout let go his joke and his laugh, and then moved to the next group, proud of his wit and happy to work it off again. "Odds blood, the sow has littered 5 times, and 5 times has made a mess of it." And now and then one was bold enough to say, but he said it softly, 63 in the might of England against a girl, and she camps on the field 5 times. Cochon lived in the great palace of the Archbishop, and it was guarded by English soldiery. But no matter, there was never a dark night but the walls showed next morning that the rude joker had been there with his paint and brush. Yes, he had been there, and had smeared the sacred walls with pictures of hogs in all attitudes except flattering ones. Hogs clothed in a bishop's vestments, and wearing a bishop's mitre irreverently cocked on the side of their heads. Cochon raged and cursed over his defeats and his impotence during 7 days. Then he conceived a new scheme. You shall see what it was, for you have not cruel hearts, and you would never guess it. On the 9th of May there was a summons, and Manchon and I got out materials together and started, but this time we were to go to one of the other towers, not the one which was Joan's prison. It was round and grim and massive, and built of the plainest and thickest and solidest masonry, a dismal and forbidding structure. Note 3. The lower half of it remains today, just as it was then. The upper half is of a later date. Translator. End of Note 3. We entered the circular room on the ground floor, and I saw what turned me sick, the instruments of torture and the executioners standing ready. Here you have the black heart of Cochon at the blackest. Here you have the proof that in his nature there was no such thing as pity. One wonders if he ever knew his mother or ever had a sister. Cochon was there, and the vice-inquisitor and the abbot of Saint-Corneille, also 6 others, among them that false Loiseleur. The guards were in their places, the rack was there, and by it stood the executioner and his aides in their crimson hose and doublets, meet color for their bloody trade. The picture of Joan rose before me, stretched upon the rack, her feet tied to one end of it, her wrists to the other, and those red giants turning the windlass and pulling her limbs out of their sockets. It seemed to me that I could hear the bones snap and the flesh tear apart, and I did not see how that body of anointed servants of the merciful Jesus could sit there and look so placid and indifferent. After a while Joan arrived and was brought in. She saw the rack, she saw the attendants, and the same picture which I had been seeing must have arisen in her mind. But do you think she quailed? Do you think she shuddered? No, there was no sign of that sort. She straightened herself up, and there was a slight curl of scorn about her lip, but as for fear, she showed not a vestige of it. This was a memorable session, but it was the shortest one of all the list. When Joan had taken her seat, a résumé of her crimes was read to her. Then Cochon made a solemn speech. In it he said that in the course of her several trials Joan had refused to answer some of the questions and had answered others with lies, but that now he was going to have the truth out of her, and the whole of it. His manner was full of confidence this time. He was sure he had found a way at last to break this child's stubborn spirit and make her beg and cry. He would score a victory this time and stop the mouths of the jokers of Rouen. You see, he was only just a man, after all, and couldn't stand ridicule any better than other people. He talked high, and his splotchy face lighted itself up with all the shifting tints and signs of evil pleasure and promised triumph, purple, yellow, red, green. They were all there, with sometimes the dull and spongy blue of a drowned man, the uncanniest of them all. And finally he burst out in a great passion and said, "There is the rack, and there are its ministers. You will reveal all now, or be put to the torture. Speak." Then she made that great answer which will live forever, made it without fuss or bravado, and yet how fine and noble was the sound of it. "I will tell you nothing more than I have told you. No, not even if you tear the limbs from my body. And even if in my pain I did say something otherwise, I would always say afterward that it was the torture that spoke and not I." There was no crushing that spirit. You should have seen Cochon, defeated again, and he had not dreamed of such a thing. I heard it said the next day around the town that he had a full confession all written out in his pocket and all ready for Joan to sign. I do not know that that was true, but it probably was, for her mark signed at the bottom of a confession would be the kind of evidence, for effect with the public, which Cochon and his people would particularly value, you know. No, there was no crushing that spirit, and no beclouding that clear mind. Consider the depth, the wisdom of that answer, coming from an ignorant girl. Why, there were not 6 men in the world who had ever reflected that words forced out of a person by horrible tortures were not necessarily words of verity and truth, yet this unlettered peasant girl put her finger upon that flaw with an unerring instinct. I had always supposed that torture brought out the truth. Everybody supposed it. And when Joan came out with those simple common-sense words, they seemed to flood the place with light. It was like a lightning flash at midnight which suddenly reveals a fair valley, sprinkled over with silver streams and gleaming valleys and farmsteads, where was only an impenetrable world of darkness before. Manchon stole a sidewise look at me, and his face was full of surprise, and there was the like to be seen in other faces there. Consider, they were old and deeply cultured, yet here was a village maid able to teach them something which they had not known before. I heard one of them utter, "Verily, it is a wonderful creature. She has laid her hand upon an accepted truth that is as old as the world, and it has crumbled to dust and rubbish under her touch. Now, whence got she that marvelous insight?" The judges laid their heads together and began to talk now. It was plain, from chance words which one caught now and then, that Cochon and Loiseleur were insisting upon the application of the torture, and that most of the others were urgently objecting. Finally Cochon broke out, with a good deal of asperity in his voice, and ordered Joan back to her dungeon. That was a happy surprise for me. I was not expecting that the bishop would yield. When Manchon came home that night, he said he had found out why the torture was not applied. There were two reasons. One was a fear that Joan might die under the torture, which would not suit the English at all. The other was that the torture would affect nothing if Joan was going to take back everything she said under its pains. And as to putting her mark to a confession, it was believed that not even the rack would ever make her do that. So all Rouen laughed again, and kept it up for 3 days, saying, "The sow has littered 6 times, and made 6 messes of it." And the palace walls got a new decoration, a mitred hog carrying a discarded rack home on its shoulder, and Loiseleur weeping in its wake. Many rewards were offered for the capture of these painters, but nobody applied. Even the English guard feigned blindness and would not see the artists at work. The bishop's anger was very high now. He could not reconcile himself to the idea of giving up the torture. It was the pleasantest idea he had invented yet, and he would not cast it by. So he called in some of his satellites on the 12th, and urged the torture again. But it was a failure. With some, Joan's speech had wrought an effect. Others feared she might die under torture. Others did not believe that any amount of suffering could make her put her mark to a lying confession. There were 14 men present, including the bishop. 11 of them voted dead against the torture, and stood their ground in spite of Cochon's abuse. 2 voted with the bishop and insisted upon the torture. These 2 were Loiseleur and the orator, the man whom Joan had bidden to read his book, Thomas de Courcelles, the renowned pleader and master of eloquence. Age has taught me charity of speech, but it fails me when I think of those 3 names, Cochon, Courcelles, Loiseleur. End of chapter 16. Volume 2, Book 3, Chapter 17, Supreme in Direst Peril. Another 10 days' wait. The great theologians of that treasury of all valuable knowledge and all wisdom, the University of Paris, were still weighing and considering and discussing the 12 lies. I had had but little to do these 10 days, so I spent them mainly in walks about the town with Noel. But there was no pleasure in them, our spirits being so burdened with cares, and the outlook for Joan growing steadily darker and darker all the time. And then we naturally contrasted our circumstances with hers, this freedom and sunshine with her darkness and chains, our comradeship with her lonely estate, our alleviations of one sort and another with her destitution in all. She was used to liberty, but now she had none. She was an out-of-door creature by nature and habit, but now she was shut up day and night in a steel cage like an animal. She was used to the light, but now she was always in a gloom where all objects about her were dim and spectral. She was used to the 1,000 various sounds which are the cheer and music of a busy life, but now she heard only the monotonous footfall of the sentry pacing his watch. She had been fond of talking with her mates, but now there was no one to talk to. She had had an easy laugh, but it was gone dumb now. She had been born for comradeship, and blithe and busy work, and all manner of joyous activities, but here were only dreariness, and leaden hours, and weary inaction, and brooding stillness, and thoughts that travel by day and night and day, round and round in the same circle, and wear the brain and break the heart with weariness. It was death in life, yes, death in life. That is what it must have been. And there was another hard thing about it all. A young girl in trouble needs the soothing solace and support and sympathy of persons of her own sex, and the delicate offices and gentle ministries which only these can furnish. Yet in all these months of gloomy captivity in her dungeon, Joan never saw the face of a girl or a woman. Think how her heart would have leapt to see such a face. Consider. If you would realize how great Joan of Arc was, remember that it was out of such a place and such circumstances that she came week after week and month after month and confronted the master intellects of France single-handed and baffled their cunningest schemes, defeated their ablest plans, detected and avoided their secretest traps and pitfalls, broke their lines, repelled their assaults, and camped on the field after every engagement, steadfast always, true to her faith and her ideals, defying torture, defying the stake, and answering threats of eternal death and the pains of hell with a simple, "Let come what may, here I take my stand and will abide." Yes, if you would realize how great was the soul, how profound the wisdom, and how luminous the intellect of Joan of Arc, you must study her there, where she fought out that long fight all alone, and not merely against the subtlest brains and deepest learning of France, but against the ignoble deceits, the meanest treacheries, and the hardest hearts to be found in any land, pagan or Christian. She was great in battle, we all know that, great in foresight, great in loyalty and patriotism, great in persuading discontented chiefs and reconciling conflicting interests and passions, great in the ability to discover merit and genius wherever it lay hidden, great in picturesque and eloquent speech, supremely great in the gift of firing the hearts of hopeless men and noble enthusiasms, the gift of turning hares into heroes, slaves and skulkers into battalions that marched to death with songs on their lips. But all these are exalting activities. They keep hand and heart and brain keyed up to their work. There is the joy of achievement, the inspiration of stir and movement, the applause which hails success. The soul is overflowing with life and energy, the faculties are at white heat. Weariness, despondency, inertia, these do not exist. Yes, Joan of Arc was great always, great everywhere, but she was greatest in the Rouen trials. There she rose above the limitations and infirmities of our human nature, and accomplished under blighting and unnerving and hopeless conditions all that her splendid equipment of moral and intellectual forces could have accomplished if they had been supplemented by the mighty helps of hope and cheer and light, the presence of friendly faces, and a fair and equal fight, with the great world looking on and wondering. End of chapter 17. Book 3, Chapter 18, Condemned, Yet Unafraid. Toward the end of the 10-day interval, the University of Paris rendered its decision concerning the 12 articles. By this finding, Joan was guilty upon all the counts. She must renounce her errors and make satisfaction, or be abandoned to the secular arm for punishment. The university's mind was probably already made up before the articles were laid before it, yet it took it from the 5th to the 18th to produce its verdict. I think the delay may have been caused by temporary difficulties concerning 2 points: 1, as to who the fiends were who were represented in Joan's voices; 2, as to whether her saints spoke French only. You understand, the university decided emphatically that it was fiends who spoke in those voices. It would need to prove that, and it did. It found out who those fiends were, and named them in the verdict: Belial, Satan, and Behemoth. This has always seemed a doubtful thing to me, and not entitled to much credit. I think so for this reason: if the university had actually known it was those 3, it would for very consistency's sake have told how it knew it, and not stopped with the mere assertion, since it had made Joan explain how she knew they were not fiends. Does not that seem reasonable? To my mind the university's position was weak, and I will tell you why. It had claimed that Joan's angels were devils in disguise, and we all know that devils do disguise themselves as angels. Up to that point the university's position was strong. But you see yourself that it eats its own argument when it turns around and pretends that it can tell who such apparitions are, while denying the like ability to a person with as good a head on her shoulders as the best one the university could produce. The doctors of the university had to see those creatures in order to know. And if Joan was deceived, it is argument that they in their turn could also be deceived, for their insight and judgment were surely not clearer than hers. As to the other point which I have thought may have proved a difficulty and cost the university delay, I will touch but a moment upon that, and pass on. The university decided that it was blasphemy for Joan to say that her saints spoke French and not English, and were on the French side in political sympathies. I think that the thing which troubled the doctors of theology was this: they had decided that the three voices were Satan and two other devils, but they had also decided that these voices were not on the French side, thereby tacitly asserting that they were on the English side, and if on the English side, then they must be angels and not devils. Otherwise the situation was embarrassing. You see, the university being the wisest and deepest and most erudite body in the world, it would like to be logical if it could, for the sake of its reputation. Therefore it would study and study, days and days, trying to find some good common-sense reason for proving the voices to be devils in Article number 1 and proving them to be angels in Article number 10. However, they had to give it up. They found no way out, and so to this day the university's verdict remains just so: devils in number 1, angels in number 10, and no way to reconcile the discrepancy. The envoys brought the verdict to Rouen, and with it a letter for Cauchon which was full of fervid praise. The university complimented him on his zeal in hunting down this woman, whose venom had infected the faithful of the whole West, and as recompense it as good as promised him a crown of imperishable glory in heaven. Only that, a crown in heaven, a promissory note, and no endorser. Always something away off yonder, not a word about the archbishopric of Rouen, which was the thing Cauchon was destroying his soul for. A crown in heaven. It must have sounded like a sarcasm to him after all his hard work. What should he do in heaven? He did not know anybody there. On the 19th of May, a court of 50 judges sat in the archiepiscopal palace to discuss Joan's fate. A few wanted her delivered over to the secular arm at once for punishment, but the rest insisted that she be once more charitably admonished first. So the same court met in the castle on the 23rd, and Joan was brought to the bar. Pierre Maurice, a canon of Rouen, made a speech to Joan in which he admonished her to save her life and her soul by renouncing her errors and surrendering to the Church. He finished with a stern threat. If she remained obstinate, the damnation of her soul was certain, the destruction of her body probable. But Joan was immovable. She said, "If I were under sentence, and saw the fire before me, and the executioner ready to light it, more, if I were in the fire itself, I would say none but the things which I have said in these trials, and I would abide by them till I died." A silence followed now, which endured some moments. It lay upon me like a weight. I knew it for an omen. Then Cauchon, grave and solemn, turned to Pierre Maurice. "Have you anything further to say?" The priest bowed low and said, "Nothing, my lord." "Prisoner at the bar, have you anything further to say?" "Nothing." "Then the debate is closed. Tomorrow sentence will be pronounced. Remove the prisoner." She seemed to go from the place erect and noble, but I do not know. My sight was dim with tears. Tomorrow, 24th of May, exactly a year since I saw her go speeding across the plain at the head of her troops, her silver helmet shining, her silvery cape fluttering in the wind, her white plumes flowing, her sword held aloft. Saw her charge the Burgundian camp 3 times and carry it, saw her wheel to the right and spur for the Duke's reserves, saw her fling herself against it in the last assault she was ever to make, and now that fatal day was come again, and see what it was bringing.
Yeah, so famously, Joan was shown the implements of torture, and just as famously, did not turn into a pile of liquid goo. She was so unfazed. And I thought it was interesting that Mark Twain was capable at this time of recognizing and saying out loud that torture probably isn't going to get you answers that are useful. People who are scared are going to say anything. people who are scared for their life are absolutely going to say anything to try and get themselves out of that situation. There are better ways to get information out of people. I am saddened to see that we still haven't listened to Mark Twain, and we still seem to have a fundamental belief that torturing people is a good idea. Although I hope that there is less of that going on now. But Joan, what a tough cookie she is. And I thought how insightful Twain was to bring up and mention the fact that she has been alone in all of this without women to talk to for the most part. And still, she managed to maintain and not cave in when Cushon played his tricks. Strong cookie, someone to be impressed by in a week of people to be impressed by. All right, with that, I am going to leave you. Have a great one. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, get vaxxed and boosted if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, take care. Talk to you later. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.